This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen. A huge thanks goes out to Donald Stinson today. Links to learn more about Don Stinson can be found in the show notes. For a time in late 2019, early 2020, impeachment was all the talk about social media and town. A bit later in 2020, impeachment has taken a back seat due to other events, but the impeachment of a president of the United States is never a small thing. This is especially so in the early 1970s during the Watergate controversy involving Richard Nixon. Our guest today, Donald Stinson, who is an author and writer who had a front row seat to all of these events as a teenage employee at the White House. Let's hear about Don's unique experiences and viewpoint. Don will help us see if Hollywood hates history with two films, Frost Nixon and Nixon. Now, just quickly, a great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. I really love to see your ratings and reviews. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter at A2Z History if you just search for this. You can also send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Links to all this and more can be found at my website, atozhistorypage.com. I will see you next time beyond the big screen. We are very proud to be joined today by Don Stinson, who happens to be a member of the American History Fanatics Facebook group, but he's also has led quite an interesting career. And Don's going, should I call you Don or Donald?
No,
Do you prefer?
Don, please. Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Stinson.
No.
We're always a little maybe overly familiar on the Beyond the Big Screen podcast, but we're really excited to be joined by Don Stinson today. Don's the author of several books, including Downstairs at the White House, a memoir about Don's time working in various positions in and around the White House during the famous Watergate affair and the impeachment of President Richard Nixon. Don is going to provide us with a unique perspective on the events of this time in American history, and he's also going to let us in a little bit on how well Hollywood portrayed these events in two movie adaptations, 1995's Nixon, starring Anthony Hopkins, and produced by Oliver Stone, along with 2008's Frost Nixon, starring Frank Langella. I'm very excited to see whether Hollywood loved or hated history with these movies, but I'm also excited to hear a little bit more about your experiences because of your fascinating book. Why don't you just get us a little bit of your context and your background and just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on your show.
It's my pleasure.
I spent most of my career in the newspaper business. And now I write and produce audiobooks. But my start when I was very young was in the White House. I started working there when I was 17, all by accident. It was one of those weird bounces in life where you know somebody who knows somebody. And I ended up starting as a clerk in the old executive office building, which is part of the White House complex. Now, the sad story about this is that for the first couple of days, I didn't realize that I actually worked in the White House complex. I thought I was just in this big building that happened to be next to the White House. And I was cleaning out a desk. I was given an assignment to clean out an office and a desk and something, real important. And I opened up one of the drawers and I came across stationery that said the White House. And I freaked out and I went across the hall to a one of the, as called in those days, secretaries, who actually, as an aside, sat in the same place where the Japanese emissaries met with the Secretary of State while the Japanese were bombing Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Anyway, I went to her and I said, "Oh my God, can you believe this? This is White House stationery. Somebody's in a lot of trouble." And she looked at me and God bless her heart, because she could have just laughed at me all day long and said, "I guess you don't realize where you are." And so she took me on a tour so that I had some idea. So I started off, a short version of a long story, is that I started off there working in the old executive office building for a group that was called the Council on International Economic Policy, again, as a clerk and messenger. In an odd series of circumstances, working in that group, for some reason, I ended up carrying materials to Capitol Hill, to the Senate, and to Republican members of the Senate Watergate Committee in these plain brown envelopes on a number of days, several, maybe 4 or 5, 6 times a week during those hearings. And never knowing what was in the envelope, nor did I ever want to find out. And from there, I ended up working for Vice President Agnew. So my life was a series of losing jobs. So I went to work for Agnew, and for a very solid reason. By then I was all of 18, and for a very solid, logical reason, and that was because I thought it'd be cool. Because he had the vice presidential seal over his door and flags and Secret Service, and I thought all that was very cool. So I ended up working for him, answering letters, and which is another story altogether about dealing with the public and the kinds of things that people would write to the Vice President of the United States, which I recount in the book. I mean, unbelievable kind of stuff. From there, I lost my job. I went over to the department, what was then called Health, Education, and Welfare, for a short, weird period of time, and then ended back in the White House, but this time in the East Wing of the White House, working on Mrs. Nixon's staff, and as a gopher and a messenger. Somebody asked me once, what kind of important things did you do? And I said, nothing. That actually, in the ranking of things, carpet lint ranked above me. So, but it was a situation, Steve, where for what unknown reasons? I mean, I had no political connections, and certainly none to Republicans whatsoever. But I ended up having way too much access to way too much of the White House for somebody who was 18 and 19 years old. It was a great experience. I was there for a while in the Ford administration, and I was doing all of this when I was in college at American University, and I had an incredible fun time, but eventually I had to leave because I needed to make more money in order to keep putting myself through school. So I went to the newspaper business, where I stayed until about 10 years ago. So that's kind of my life in a nutshell.
Before we dive in right into Watergate, because it is kind of related, was it unusual? If you read Don's book, you'll see that you just have one adventure after another. Was that more to do with your personality that you were able to get into some of these unusual circumstances? Is this something that somebody in a similar position, say today, would have been able to get into? Just for example, where you were, you would do your homework, or you wound up reading in the White House library,
right,
and you got yelled at.
Yeah.
But would that have been somebody would have wound up going to federal penitentiary nowadays?
Yeah, very well could. Well, number one, things were a lot looser in those days. When we had tourists come into the White House, they didn't go through metal detectors. I mean, we didn't have any. I walked in every day through the north gate of the White House with a briefcase that I carried my school stuff in, and many mornings walked right past the President of the United States in the colonnade in the Rose Garden. No one ever checked my briefcase. I mean, it was a whole different world back there. Now, some of this has to do with my personality. I was in the newspaper business, but I was on the marketing side, the sales and marketing. And so, us sales guys were a little crazy anyway. But I've had this weird thing that's followed me my whole life, and that I ended up in odd situations, and a number of them historic. So I was in the White House the day that Nixon resigned and stood out on the South Lawn when he gave his famous wave goodbye. I was in the East Room when Ford took the oath of office. A number of years later, I happened to be the distance of about a wall away from one of the first mass workplace murders in Louisville, Kentucky, that happened in 1989. In 1990, it was either 92 or 93, I happened to walk out of the World Trade Center right before it was, minutes before it was bombed the first time by terrorists. I ended up in the middle of 9/11 in Washington, where my office was about 2 miles as the crow flies from the Pentagon. And so I've had a series of these kinds of things that have happened. I have no idea. But I will say this, if there's a moral to the story in my book, and I wrote it for two audiences. I wrote it for people who like history, remember Watergate, and for younger people, who are coming up. And the thing is, if you never ask for something, you're never going to know if you can get it. Number two, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. and three, they can't eat you. That was one of the things that my dad told me when I first went to college. That was his advice to me. He goes, just remember, they can't eat you. They may fire you. They may do a lot of stuff to you, but go ask, go try something. So, I asked, and more often than not, I got something. And, when you kind of just blend in with things, I was a kid. So, I used to, the Howlers, who were the chefs, the head chef in the White House. They used to feed me leftovers because I was a kid. I was a college kid. I was starving all the time. There's a lot of stuff you can get away with when you're young. Next month I'll be 65. I can't get away with that anymore. But when I was 17 and 18, I could get away with a lot. So.
I think that's when I read the book, listened to the book, I think this is obviously I'm not 18 years old, far from it, but it was definitely an enjoyable book for me. But I think for somebody who's maybe 16, 17, 18 to listen to this book and see what possibilities there are, sure. And to, and to give somebody, we're getting close on to 50 years from this particular time period, to get the sense. it wasn't a top-down history. You're getting a view of this history, which we'll get into in just a few minutes, of really from the bottom looking upwards, not, the worm's eye view, which is such a different perspective that we normally get instead of this 10,000 foot view history. It's such a real perspective on history that that was so refreshing to me.
Oh, great. I'm glad you like that. It was good. See, that was one of the things that I had a big problem. I don't want to jump ahead, but I got to get this off my chest. I don't like Oliver Stone, and I didn't like JFK, and I certainly didn't like Nixon. And one of the things I hated was the portrayal of Mrs. Nixon, who was one of the nicest, kindest, sweetest ladies I have ever met in my life. And, he portrayed her, he likes to provide his own history, his own version of history, whether it's true or not. And, he portrayed her as a drunk and, barely being able to put up with the president and all of that. All I can tell you is that she was a joy to be around. You may remember the story when I got in trouble because I was walking through what's called the vaulted archway in it's not the sub basement, but the floor. You see it a lot on television, and it's on tours. There's a big red carpet and all that stuff. And I was walking through, and I went past the elevator for the first family, takes them up to their quarters. And there was a woman standing there, and she had a scarf on, and this voice just said, "Hiya, kiddo." And I just said back, "Hiya, kiddo." And I got back to my little tiny cubby hole I sat in the basement of the East Wing, and somebody on, I think it was Mrs. Nixon's chief of staff, caught up with me and said, "How dare you say that to the first lady?" I said, what are you talking about? I had no idea that I said that to her. And there are a lot of people who think they're very important, and they act in a very arrogant way, quite differently. She ended up calling me because she knew I had gotten in trouble, and she called me to say, "You're not in any trouble whatsoever," and asked me a bunch of questions about my family and all that kind of stuff. And every time I would see her after that, she'd always ask me about my family, my mom and dad, and such, and my studies. She was a very warm, very kind lady, and so was Mrs. Ford. But I really didn't like that portrayal of Mrs. Nixon at all. And I mean, that movie was a flop at the box office anyway, because there wasn't a lot of realism to it. And at least from the stuff that I saw, I mean, I saw different sides of it, and very often the things that were going on that made big headlines were happening in the area where I was, but it was behind closed doors. Actually, I would learn more about what was going on inside, 20 feet away from me by listening to the radio read in the Washington Post. Rarely did you hear a lot of the bigger kind of stuff that went on. But she was lovely. The president was made out. Am I on the track that you want to go down?
Well, let's we'll definitely get into that aspect of their personalities, but let's quickly just do the 10,000 foot overview of what was the whole Watergate affair about.
Well, some guys, some crazy guys got an idea of breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate in Washington, which is located, actually it's being torn down now, but it's located next to the Kennedy Center. Very upscale place, a series of offices and apartments and such. And they got caught by a security guard. And these were all ex-CIA, got some guys that were involved with the Bay of Pigs. They were a very motley, in part crazy bunch. And they were arraigned. And of all the people who happened to be there was during this arraignment was this young reporter at that time, unknown, named Bob Woodward. And he happened to take all of this down, and they basically tracked this down to find out that there was a connection to the White House and to the committee to reelect the president, which was which in the law of unintended consequences was also called CREEP as an acronym. And basically what Nixon attempted to do was to cover it up. And he used and tried to use powerful elements of the government to create that cover-up. In comparison to today, it's nothing. At that time, that was huge and very, very shocking to the American people. Of course, he made the mistake of, which may have been arrogant, I think, in a lot of ways. I mean, he recorded conversations that were telephone conversations and conversations that were held in the Oval Office. So had LBJ, so had JFK. I think Ike did. Actually, I think the first one might have actually been FDR. Way too much of this plotting and planning of obstruction of justice was on tapes, which is eventually what caught up with them. And when those were ordered by the Supreme Court in case U.S. v. Nixon, that he had to turn those tapes over to the Watergate special prosecutor, who then turned them over to the House of Representatives, to the Judiciary Committee. He was toast. In part, I mean, an interesting sidelight to it is that apparently John Connally, who had been the governor of Texas, who had also been the Treasury Secretary, who had also been in the car with JFK and shot on November 22nd, 1963, had advised Nixon to take those tapes out on the South Lawn and pour gas on them and light them. And apparently he didn't want to do anything of the sort because he wanted to use them for his memoir. So he was hoisted on his own petard with that. Otherwise, there would have been no way to prove that he had been involved in the cover-up. It is a very sad chapter in our history. A lot of people, including the Attorney General of the United States, went to prison as a result of it. There were some great heroics that I would suggest that people may have heard during the impeachment, the Trump impeachment. They may have brought up the name of a guy named Larry Hogan, who I later knew. I didn't know him at the time. He was a member of Republican from Congress, who's from Maryland, who was very brave and stood up to say, this isn't going to fly, and we're going to have to remove him from office. There was a lot. It was all very extremely dramatic at the time. I think the best book probably to read on it is All the President's Men, and to really get a ground level view of what went on and how it all unfolded.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. And so it's really interesting that you're a 18, 19, early 20s kid, really college kid, and you're working your regular job. And then, like you said, a lot in many aspects, you were just working a pretty mundane, regular job. But there's this earth-shattering world history events going on around you. Was there any scuttlebutt in the cafeteria about it or around the water cooler?
Yeah. I tell you what, the side of it that I saw the most, was what was going on with the staff and the residents and other people like me who were part of what's known as the White House office. There were a lot of people who, and rightly so, whether they were civil service or not, were scared about what was going to happen with their jobs. And when they found out that I had worked for Agnew and had lost my job when he resigned, that didn't make a lot of my friends and colleagues there, didn't make them feel very confident. There was, I do it this way, the tension in the place as we got into the latter part of July and the beginning of August that year, you could cut with a knife. People were very on edge. People who would not normally lose their tempers would. I mean, I didn't write about it just a little bit in the book, but I got tongue lashed by General Haig, who is Nixon's chief of staff, more than once for not for anything in particular. But then, I look back at it now as an old guy and I go, geez, you're under that kind of pressure. Those kinds of things are going to happen. But people were very, it went between sadness and anger. And the anger was directed not so much at Nixon, but at the House of Representatives and the Special Prosecutor's Office, when they really should have been angry with President Nixon. And yeah, it's just an interesting, the White House, at least at that time, I can only speak for it at that juncture in history, it was just like any other place that you'd work. Rumors went around. people, it's like anybody. People are people. And just because it's the White House, it just, the rumors might have more interest than they would necessarily at an insurance company or something. But it's all the same thing. And but on the other hand, what was kind of funny was there was one guy in particular who was a friend of mine who worked on that. I will say he worked on the House staff for the residents, who used to walk around rubbing his hands, quoting Sir Walter Scott's, "Oh, what a wicked web we weave when first we aspire to deceive." And that was going on. There was a guy in the West Wing who did the carpets, who used to sing an old song called "Don't Lie to Me." He'd sing that at night. So it was a circus. In part, it was a circus. And you never know who you're going to run into at any given point. So it was a fascinating moment in history that I was very, very incredibly fortunate to be around. And but the thing that I learned was, hey, invite yourself to the party. The worst thing they can do is throw you out.
I think listening to the book and really thinking about it, it's the people that are the most interesting. And under these circumstances, but even any circumstance, you really get to learn something about somebody is how they treat, basically the underlings, the people who, don't, depending on what kind of person
Right.
they were, they might not even exist. Like you, the guy who cleans the carpets, the person who squeegees the windows. Just for an example, like when Alexander Haig yelled at you, was it over something like, that you put the staples perpendicular instead of, was it
Well,
instead of on the diagonal? Like was
no, I mean, it was, he gave me, on one occasion, he handed me something to take somewhere, and because I wasn't, running, he was angry. But then again, that's stress. And
a general.
But on the other hand, he could be very charming. So I have to say that most everybody that I worked with, from the highest to the lowest, were very nice people. They were respectful. They were kind. They saw me like as what we had in the 70s at one time was a thing called a pet rock. That was a big deal for a while. And I was like a pet rock. I mean, I was just, and they were very nice. And, we talk about how they treat people. I mean, no one had to, Mrs. Nixon certainly didn't have to ask me how my parents were doing. The president didn't have to stop that morning that I wrote about and talk to me. There were cabinet secretaries I knew. There were Senators Goldwater and Scott, who were two of the three that went over to tell Nixon that he had to resign, who were very nice to me. I mean, the lesson I learned is most people are nice. And the ones that aren't, they think too highly of themselves, and they're going to fall. But I stood, I had a chance to stand. I got on the elevator in the West Wing, just by accident, with John Connolly. Okay. I ended up, and just as yet another aside, I ended up getting to know several of the people who were in the car with JFK on the day that he was assassinated, which to me was mind-blowing. But Connolly, he stopped. I'd asked him a question about something, and he stood there and talked to me for a little while, wanted to know about me. I mean, these guys are politicians, but at the same time, they didn't have to do that. They didn't have to do that at all. And so most of them, like I said, were very nice. Rosemary Woods, who was the president's secretary, the suspected of the 18.5-minute gap on the Watergate tapes. She was, utterly charming. We used to have this silly thing where I would always try. I was just enamored of the presidential seal, and in those days, not too many things were printed with it on it, and so she had matchbooks on her desk, and every time I went by and I saw her, I'd try to get a couple, and she'd like tell me, "No, today you can have one. If you're better tomorrow, you could have two." But I mean, like I said, they were just people, and they're just nice people. I was very lucky, very fortunate.
Speaking of people, let's talk about the big man. What were generally with Nixon, you get the impression, especially in the Nixon film, of this dark and brooding and almost, like a villain, super villain character. From your perspective and the people who you worked with, what did they think of Nixon himself?
Well,
as a person,
I can tell you that the people that worked on the House staff, the butlers, they liked the entire family. So rather than being this, crude, brooding, nasty guy, the president knew all of their names and would thank them, for getting things for him or doing one thing or another. I mean, so he was made out, most people that are historical figures, my opinion is that they have been made out they're like, cardboard cutouts. They're one dimensional. They are whatever they are. I mean, a long time ago, I knew George W. Bush. Well, George W. Bush, the way he was in the 70s, was the same way he was when I ran into him at a dinner in Washington in the early 2000s. I mean, he was just a fun, funny kind of guy. But a lot of people would say that, he was dumb. Well, he wasn't dumb at all, but that's, the characteristic. Anyway, so I give this one example about Nixon. I mean, I was very fortunate, again, to meet and chat with a number of presidents, both who were in office and not. And they were all unique in their own way. But Nixon, I found more unique than anyone else because, I wrote about it in the book. I bumped into him one morning. I mean, I told you how I used to walk through. I used to try to walk through so I could say good morning, Mr. President, and run across him as he was going to the Oval Office. And one day he stopped me because I was carrying a book about Theodore Roosevelt, and he was a huge fan of TR. And he stopped me, and he said, "So what are you reading?" And I showed him. And I would love to tell you, Steve, that it was a conversation, but it wasn't. I stood there listening, and I think the only reason he stopped me is because I had a pulse. He wanted to talk to somebody, but he went on for I really don't know how long it was because I was mesmerized. He talked about Roosevelt. He talked about Winston Churchill. One of the things that he, in that period of time that he spoke to me, left a great impression. And he said that one of the reasons that both TR and Roosevelt, and Churchill, were so successful was because they not only read about to understand the history of the people that they led, but they wrote about it. And it gave them incredible insight into the body politic that other people never had. And, but anyway, we had this, like I said, I listened. He talked, I listened. And he didn't have to do that. He never had to say good morning, for that matter. So again, but I also said that I've never felt ever since, and that's been, we're getting close to 50 years. I have never felt the same electricity around any other human being I've ever met. There was just something about him, and it may have been that he was so absolutely brilliant. Despite Watergate, he was a brilliant man. And that was, going back to the movie, that's something that Stone didn't give him any credit for. He gave him no credit for China, no credit for Russia. He gave him no credit for any of the good things that he did. The EPA, Title IX. It's a long list of things that helped a lot of people. And Stone focused on things that weren't so successful. A lot of people have an axe to grind. But I think, history is judging him in a better light as we move out and looking back at him and to separate and say, well, there was something that he did that was very bad and very illegal, and he should have paid a price for it. But on the other hand, you've got to look at the things that he did that made the United States more powerful, made our lives more safe and more bountiful, and contributed to the welfare of the nation. He was really kind of one of the last of the New Deal presidents in the way that he looked at government power as a way to be able to solve problems. And so he's a very unique guy, but he was not this one-dimensional, guy that cartoonists and other people made him out to be. At least that wasn't my experience. Nor was that the experience of the butlers and the maids and a lot of other people that interacted with him a lot.
One of the other movies was Frost-Nixon, which was from 2008, and that was based around the Frost-Nixon interviews.
Right.
Do you think that captured a little bit something more of the real Nixon than maybe the Oliver Stone version did? Because the Oliver Stone movies, I mean, you listed a couple of them. They all are very Oliver Stone's perspective of history, which may not actually line up with actual history. Do you think that Frost-Nixon got something a little bit more correct?
Well, I remember watching those the Frost interviews very closely, and my 2 cents worth is that was very, very, very close to what actually happened in the conversations that actually occurred. From what I watched on television, what I read in the papers, what I heard other commentators talk about, what at that time I heard people who were still close to Nixon, who had been in the White House that I still knew, had said about that entire thing. I think Nixon was being as honest about any of that stuff as he was ever going to be, with the exception of when he gave a speech, which I think was later on, must have been later on, at Oxford, in which he said, "I screwed up." And that was about as honest as you get to admit that. And he did. Yeah, let me throw in one other interesting thing for your audience. I'm sure that a number of the people that are in the same Facebook group and other of us that are fanatics about history may have gone to the Nixon Library. Oddly enough, I have never been there. They sell my book there, but I've never had the opportunity to go out there. But what I am told is that the display out there, that Nixon wanted that the biggest display there had to be about Watergate, not about any of the other things that he had done in his entire life, because that was the thing that everybody was always going to be the most controversial, and that had to be dealt with in the literally, I mean, physically, literally biggest way. It's like the exhibit's like 80 feet long. So I think he would. I think history will judge him better as time goes on.
I think it's interesting, his presidency, because we are getting close to 50 years later, and I don't know if it's just that it's the new way media works, is that something that happened 6 months ago is ancient history. Do you think that the story and the nitty-gritty and the details of Watergate have had the staying power you would have expected would have? It just doesn't seem like it's as well understood as many historical events go, that it's just something that happened and that we've moved on. People have vague impressions of what happened and of Nixon, and then it's pretty much that's that.
I think you're dead on about that. And that's true of a lot of other things. I've been dismayed at a lot of younger people, and, to me, 50 is relatively young. So that have really no sense of anything that happened over the last century. And that is a great shame and a danger to democracy. I have been, on the flip side, because there's always a flip side, I have been very interested in some of the, shocked isn't the right word, but that I have heard from a number of people who are, college students and younger folks who said that they had read a lot about Watergate because they were very interested in how all of those pieces came together. And they came together in some odd ways to create the outcome of Nixon's resignation. Of course, old folks have been remember all of it very well. But I think you're absolutely right. Now, hell, for that matter, something happened 2 weeks ago could be ancient history. But there are so many lessons to be learned by history, as you well know, that we need to put a much bigger emphasis on it in schools because we don't want to make the same mistakes again and again and again.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. With the perspective of actually being there for the events and living in the next several decades afterwards, how do you think that the events of Nixon, not just Watergate, but his whole presidency, it sure seems like they marked a major change in how the United States works. I mean, just like somebody like Nixon, I would be hard pressed to think that somebody like him, who was kind of, not a very outgoing person. I think you may have even described him as introverted.
Yeah.
Does he seem like somebody who could ever be elected as president ever again?
Again, you go back to history. He won by an eyelash. In fact, I remember that election day very, very well. He won by an eyelash, and partially, it really had nothing to do with his personality because he wasn't exactly. If you took him and Hubert Humphrey and put them next to one another, Nixon really looked like, he was like a dead fish, because Humphrey was ebullient. But I think what people did is, in many ways, they remembered him from way back. They remembered him from the Senate, certainly as vice president. We had not come to the point. We were just at the beginning of the point where television was either making or breaking politicians. The first real event on that was the debate in 1960 with Nixon and Kennedy. There was no debate in 1964. There was no debate in 1968, but there was a huge issue about packaging Nixon. If you read the Theodore White's The Making of the President in 1968, you see that basically he was taken by Madison Avenue, remade into the new Nixon, and then sold essentially like a bar of soap. Politics changed. And then in the aftermath of Watergate, people, there was, first of all, there was a rush of people that wanted to go to journalism school. Everybody wanted to be Woodward Bernstein. That has taken things, I think, off balance. We now know too much. And as media exploded, now we know too much about too many things and too many things that are wrong. So that changed a great deal. The way that people look, I mean, a lot of laws changed in the wake of Watergate. So that whole period, I think you can take from 1968 all the way forward until at least the late 80s. My 2 cents worth, there were periods of great change in American politics in the way that campaigns were approached. But you do notice over time that we've had more presidents who are much more telegenic as time has gone on. And Nixon certainly wasn't telegenic.
It's interesting that Nixon, he's really defined by Watergate his entire career. But you said, even like you were saying, as in his presidency, he had quite a list of accomplishments, and he was a vice president before that for 8 pretty successful years. And in 1960, he lost to Kennedy by fairly much an eyelash, which would have probably have been a big change in how he's perceived if he had won that election. And even if he was one and done after that, we would have a very different idea of Nixon today.
Indeed we would. It's also, you can muse about the fact that had he committed the same crimes in, let's say, 1962, he did in 1972, he might have escaped because the world was a different place. The involvement, the exposure of some of those things were different in those days. So yeah, the outcome would have been very different, I think.
To wrap up our conversation today, if you could make a movie of those times, or, maybe, show it a more realistic, what would be something that you would focus in on about that time period that you feel that maybe hasn't been discussed enough?
Well, I think first I would make it all about me and my book. Just in case anybody's listening out there that would like to make a movie. No, seriously, I think the thing that's missing is an understanding of how much different the world is between 1972 and today. It is mind-boggling. It's not just tech. A lot of it's driven by technology, but we had explosive changes that immediately preceded the 70s, and then obviously we're sped up in many ways by technology. But the world that I lived in when I was a teenager was a much slower world. It was a much more polite place in many ways. It was not by any means or any stretch of the imagination necessarily better, but it was different. And the way that you treated people, the pace at which you did things was altogether different. And I think that would be the part to understand, that there were not, as you go through Watergate, in particular, or really any of those things up until the early 2000s, these instantaneous communications didn't exist. I mean, you waited, and you had fewer sources of information, and there was less traffic. I mean, life was in many ways, the stress was different. It may not have necessarily been less, but it was different. And I think that is at root, because what happened in the early 1970s, and again continued into the internet age, was a vastly vastly different world. I mean, it was a mind-blowing deal when FedEx first came along. Now, today, everybody just thinks, that's always been there. Like, many kids today think that there have always been cell phones. We didn't communicate at that kind of speed. And the reason I had the job that I did was because you actually needed messengers. I mean, I carried things that would be emails. So I was very lucky to live when I did, or I wouldn't have had that job. So, but I think it's an interesting thing to study and see, and then to look back to the time my grandparents had been born in the 1890s, and to look at the changes in that world compared to what happened in the 60s and 70s and 80s, compared yet to today, it's just mind-blowing. But you can see the changes in attitudes. You can see the changes in I think in many ways, how we view different events. We lost a lot of innocence in Watergate, and we've never recovered it. And the world, I think, has become a harder, colder place as a result. But there's good and bad.
Yeah, I think that maybe that is the perspective of Watergate, is that it really it threw the curtains open on a lot of things that were going on. And it is generally the rug got pulled out from under society in general. And like you said, so many things have changed, that had started at that time and before that maybe had nothing to do with Watergate, but Watergate, with all these other changes, definitely have changed the society in many ways, and maybe not in all the best ways across the board. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. As usual, in these episodes, I've learned so much, and your perspectives are fascinating, and I definitely think people should go and look for your book. If maybe just quick, I will put links in the show notes to all these things, but maybe if you could discuss how to get your book in, maybe if there's some other projects that you're working on that you'd like to share about.
Well, great. Well, the book is Downstairs at the White House, the story of a teenager, an Oval Office, and a ringside seat to Watergate. You can get it from Amazon and Kindle for just $2.99. You can get it in paperback, and you can get it, as you know, in audio. It's also available at all major retailers. A lot of it at this point, by overnight delivery rather than in stores. But we're in a number of Books A Million stores around the country and others that. And I think my hope is that if you pick it up, you will get a lot of laughs out of it, and you'll see the world a little bit differently, or at least that part of the world a little differently, in terms of how a kid reacted to those things. Actually, some people, I'll put this plug in. A number of people last year I heard from who bought the book for graduating high school seniors as a graduation gift and said, go do what this crazy guy did. So that might be some help. So at least I never got arrested. That's the good part,
Yeah, that's a plus.
Today I might have, but now I'm working on another book. Actually, I'm working on a novel. I'm working on I hope a comedy. We'll see if it's funny or not. And I'm doing audio books. I mean, I live in Florida and enjoy semi-retirement. But people have asked about writing a sequel to it, and I might at some point, just because I had a lot of other interesting experiences that folks seem to be interested in it on occasion. So as I mentioned early in the conversation, some of them were very, very scary things that went on. But all I can say is I've been very fortunate. And to the young folks out there, invite yourself to the party, because you just never know what'll happen, and they can't eat you.
I think that's a great message to leave us off with. And thank you again so much for coming on.
The pleasure has been all mine, Steve. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.